No, close the public hearing. Any motion or any further discussion, council?
I mean, I don't like doing all these different emergency ordinances, but the Coastal Commission really gives us no choice.
Mhm.
Because it doesn't feel intellectually right that there's an emergency, a public safety threat here that has happened now 3 times that we've had to keep, because usually when there's a public safety threat, it's not over a 2.5,
Mhm.
year, but I think it's what the cards that were dealt. So I'm supportive of what staff's come up with here and with their work. And I appreciate their work with the Coastal Commission.
I agree. Anybody else have a alternate view?
No.
No,
Do we need to ask the city clerk to read the title
Yep.
of the ordinances?
she's not there.
We will need to read the titles of the ordinances.
Sure.
I can play city clerk if you'd like.
Yeah, you want to play the city
Alright.
clerk? Okay.
The urgency ordinance is entitled An Urgency Ordinance of the City of Laguna Beach, California, recodifying Chapter 25.95 of the Laguna Beach Municipal Code, regulating single-family residential 1 and 2 unit developments and urban lot splits pursuant to California Senate Bill at 9, parenthetical SB 9. And the title of the regularly adopted ordinance is An Ordinance of the City of Laguna Beach, California, adding Chapter 25.95 to the Laguna Beach Municipal Code, regulating single-family residential 1 and 2 unit developments and urban lot splits pursuant to California Senate Bill 9, parenthetical SB 9, as modified by the California Coastal Commission, and making a finding of exemption under the California Environmental Quality Act.
What she said.
So, with the reading of the two titles, I would move the recommended actions 1, 2, and 3.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Great. Thank you. Okay, it takes us to item 20, which is introduction and first reading of an ordinance amending certain portions of Titles 1 and 25 of the Laguna Beach Municipal Code and determining that no further environmental review is required pursuant to Public Resources Code, Section 21.166. Hi, Anthony. Good evening, Jennifer.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. Item number 20 is a noticed public hearing for an introduction and first reading of an ordinance amending Titles 1 and 25 of the Municipal Code, generally relating to housing. And we'll start with just a bit of background. The City Council approved the 6th cycle housing element in January of last year, which was certified by state HCD the following month. The housing element establishes a number of programs that the city will need to implement. The most pertinent programs for this draft ordinance relate to bringing the zoning code into conformance with state housing laws and amending the zoning code to reduce barriers to housing production. The draft ordinance before you incorporates the feedback that staff has received over the course of 10 public meetings with the Planning Commission and Housing and Human Services Committee. We will start by taking a look at the proposed standards related to mixed-use development. And as we go through each proposed amendment, you will see the associated housing element program referenced in a blue text box. Today, the commercial zones generally allow residential uses as part of mixed-use development. However, the standards applied to residential uses are quite a bit more restrictive than the standards that apply to non-residential uses. This includes more restrictive setbacks, open space requirements, density restrictions, and maximum floor areas. As a starting point for this ordinance, staff wanted to ensure that the residential standards were no more burdensome than what is required for second floor offices and other non-residential uses. From there, we then considered how we might try to incentivize residential uses above a ground floor commercial space in lieu of perhaps providing additional commercial space on that second floor. The graphic on the screen illustrates how the existing development standards diverge between housing and non-residential use on that second floor. Imagine that the floor plan is oriented with Coast Highway on the left-hand side of that plan. A second floor office or other non-residential use would generally be subject just to a 5-foot setback from Coast Highway, which is shown with that hatched line. And the red transparency is the typical residential envelope in that same mixed-use zone. The front yard setback would increase from 5 to 20 feet. Residential uses are also subject to side and rear yard setback requirements that generally do not apply to commercial projects. And so the building envelope shrinks to the area in white for the typical infill residential project. A commercial project could potentially build more square footage, which could potentially discourage a mixed-use housing project. Several amendments are proposed to reduce the zoning constraints. And these amendments include allowing residential uses by right by removing the conditional use permit requirement, matching the residential and commercial setback requirements, removing a restriction that limits the residential floor area to 50% of the commercial space, allowing market rate residential on the ground floor if located behind street fronting commercial, removing density restrictions, and allowing residential units to be added to a site without providing additional open space. Regarding the parking requirements, staff proposes to allow residential parking to remain uncovered to match the commercial standard. Additionally, staff is proposing 1 parking space per residential dwelling unit, and as recommended by the Planning Commission, the requirement would be reduced to half a space for each unit that is less than 700 square feet in area and located within close walking distance to a public transit stop. To satisfy the residential requirement, options would include providing the parking on site. Applicants would also have the option to purchase in lieu parking certificates for the residential requirement. The draft ordinance also includes several incentives to further encourage upper infill housing projects as an alternative to, say, a second floor office space. An applicant would qualify for these incentives if they agree to not convert the residential units to short-term lodging and to encourage smaller units that are more affordable by design. It would also require that at least half the units are 700 square feet each or smaller. If they agree to do this, the code would allow for a waiver of the additional building setback requirement, which is depicted with the dashed line on the screen here. Where that dashed line attains a height of 15 feet, the building envelope angles in at a 45-degree angle, pushing those upper floors further towards the center of the lot. And that would be waived for those projects that meet those requirements. Other incentives would include an allowance to retain the non-conforming commercial space in the event that the project rises to the level of a major remodel. Ordinarily, these mixed-use projects would need to bring the entire site into conformance with current zoning requirements, including any existing non-conforming conditions. Shown on the screen is a zoning map exhibit illustrating where those changes would apply They would not apply to the downtown specific plan area, but they do apply to 3 commercial zones that generally front Coast Highway, both to the north and south of the downtown. And it includes the South Laguna Village Commercial District that's just north of the hospital. The housing element also directs the city to develop incentives to encourage lot mergers for the purpose of building affordable housing. To qualify, the project must either be an affordable or senior housing project with a combined lot size capped at 25,000 square feet. Qualifying projects would be eligible for reductions in the required building setbacks, parking and open space, as well as a refund on building and planning fees at the conclusion of the project. Next, we will briefly walk through several amendments that respond to requirements in state law. Provisions would be added to the zoning code that reference the requirements of the density bonus law. Density bonus is a tool that developers may use to receive increased housing density and other incentives in exchange for restricting a certain percentage of the proposed units to lower income or senior households. The number of incentives that a city has to grant are based on a sliding scale. The housing element also requires that the city amend the zoning code to address state laws related to single room occupancy units, transitional housing, supportive housing, and low barrier navigation centers. For the most part, these housing types are not fully addressed within the zoning code today. The city is also updating its existing reasonable accommodation provisions as part of this housing element program. Transitional housing is a type of supportive housing. It's intended to facilitate a homeless individual's transition into a permanent housing situation. There is a predetermined length of stay of at least 6 months. Supportive housing can take several forms, but it is always linked to supportive services. These services could include employment services, as well as medical and mental health care. Low barrier navigation centers are a type of emergency shelter that focuses on quickly securing permanent housing for individuals and families. Single room occupancy, or SRO, is a multifamily housing model of 6 or more small efficiency units that share certain amenities such as kitchens and showers. And these are usually created through conversions of existing buildings, oftentimes hotels. These uses would generally be subject to the development standards that apply to other residential uses in the same zone. The table on the screen indicates where these housing types would be allowed, and this generally tracks with the requirements in state law. With transitional housing, that housing type would be allowed in any zone that allows for residential uses. That includes the mixed-use commercial zones. Supportive housing is similar, except it would not include single-family zones. Low barrier navigation centers would be permitted within any zone that is non-residential but allows for multifamily use. And single room occupancy would be allowed in 2 of our commercial hotel motel zone and the city's 2 light industrial zones along Laguna Canyon Road. The code amendments would also replace the existing home occupation regulations with a new set of standards that would facilitate a greater range of home-based businesses. While home occupations are currently allowed, they are not particularly adaptable to different business needs. For example, today, all employees must reside at the location of the home-based business, And the code also does not permit home occupations that generate customer traffic to the home. Now, there is one exception to this, which we refer to as the commercial home occupation. There are only 2 zones that allow this type of use, both of which are commercial zones, and one of those requires that the operator receive a conditional use permit. Commercial home occupations are also treated as intensifications of use that require additional off-street parking, which on many sites would make commercial home occupations challenging to establish. The proposed home occupation provisions would begin with an intent and purpose section that emphasizes that home occupations are subordinate to the residential use and that the business activity would not be a detriment to the character and livability of the surrounding uses. We referred back to this intent and purpose as we developed the list of allowable uses, prohibited uses, and operating standards. Allowed uses could include art and craft work, tutoring, professional offices, and personal services such as hair salons. This list is not exhaustive, and the director would have the authority to approve an unlisted use found to be of the same general character. Uses that were deemed inconsistent with the intent and purpose include carpentry and manufacturing, both of which pose potential noise concerns. There would be no public hearing process unless the director's decision is appealed. We have therefore developed operating standards that would apply to all home occupations. These include restrictions on customer vehicle trips, an allowance for only 1 non-resident employee for a home occupation in a residential zone or 2 in a commercial zone, restrictions on commercial vehicles, allowing them only in commercial zones, a general standard that prohibits a use from being operated in an objectionable manner, and a requirement that any business-related visitors be by appointment only, with hours limited to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., and not to exceed 2 visitors at any one time in a residential zone or 4 in other zones. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Jennifer Savage.
Thank you. Good evening. So the next program highlighted in the blue square is the Inclusionary Housing Program under the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing section in the housing element. It requires us to update the inclusionary housing policy to enhance the feasibility and production of affordable housing. In discussion with the Housing and Human Services Committee regarding the inclusionary housing policy, it was identified that the current requirement is a constraint on housing development. Thus, the changes that we're proposing tonight are supposed to facilitate development for housing as a whole, as well as increase affordable housing. The 2 main changes before you this evening are changing the applicability of the projects. On the left-hand side, you see the existing provisions requiring inclusionary housing for subdivisions of 2 or more units or lots, and for development of 3 or more units. On the right-hand side is the proposed provisions, which would apply at 5 or more units or lots for any new development, subdivision, redevelopment, or conversions in the case where you're converting commercial to residential. The second main change is looking at the requirement of inclusionary in a project. On the left-hand side, it shows the existing provision, which requires 25% of proposed housing units to be dedicated to affordable housing at various income levels. The proposed requirement is to reduce that to 15% dedicated to affordable housing units, with the split between very low and low housing. Other provisions include adding a provision that requires a portion of those inclusionary housing units dedicated to artists, and that would be within the Arts District in the downtown specific plan, as well as within a half a mile of that Arts District. Other provisions include making the inclusionary housing units similar to the market rate units, and also highlighting the incentives to providing inclusionary housing units, including those incentives in the density bonus law, as well as the welfare exemptions for financial savings. The affordability covenant is reduced in this provision for rental units from 55 to 25 years and for sale units from 45 to 15 years. Our city attorney team did identify that this could be a difficult point for projects because the reduction in the affordability covenant is inconsistent with typical funding requirements. But the lower affordability covenant means those smaller projects in town that may not be competitive or eligible for funding would have a lower affordability covenant and perhaps a greater incentive to comply with the inclusionary housing requirements. Our recommendation this evening is to introduce the ordinance that amends certain provisions of Titles 1 and 25 and determine that no further environmental review is required. By 1, asking the city clerk to read the title of the ordinance, and 2, approving a motion to waive further reading of the ordinance and to pass it to a second reading. This concludes staff presentation, and we are available for questions.
I just have a couple questions. So on the map of the coastline, why are we excluding the downtown specific plan? The reason I ask is it seemed like, there's that building right over there where Slice Pizza's it's a 3-story building. It's office, but it could be converted to housing very easily. There's bathrooms in there. Some places have showers.
Yes, thank you for that question, Mayor Kempf. As part of the Phase 2 Downtown Specific Plan update, which is currently under development, we have anticipated that some of these amendments could potentially appear in the draft update to the Downtown Specific Plan as well.
Okay, makes sense. Also on the parking, why do we, so for, where is it in here? You said for spaces, for units under 700 square feet, we have a half space. And what's the point of that? I mean, I know if you have 4 units, you have 2 spaces or whatever, but why do we, I don't know why we'd care. I mean, you want to incent this, right? And I think parking is always the sticking point. So I don't know why you have for those really,
Be through in lieu as well.
or it could be in lieu, but yeah. What would the in lieu fee? We haven't set that, right?
The fee is currently set at $23,000 per certificate. As part of your adopted parking and transportation demand management report, we are looking at a potential update to that program, which could include adjusting that fee.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it just seems to me if we want to incent this, yeah, okay.
I have a couple questions. So first off, I really appreciate staff for getting this here. I think this was recommended in the Affordable Housing Task Force report from 2018 or 2019. The recommendation was to look at this issue of the 50% ratio rule for second floor residential. So I really appreciate Anthony and Jennifer and the work that you and the Housing and Human Services Committee have done to finally get this close to across the finish line, because we still have to go to the Coastal Commission. So so my question is kind of about the timing of it. Let's assume that for the sake of discussion that we approve this as a first reading and then a second reading. Have you spoken to Coastal staff at all about this and what the timing would be?
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem. We have had a meeting with Coastal staff just to broach the general thrust of these changes. And so they are aware, and that was sort of a hip check for us to gauge their receptiveness to these changes. None of the changes so far have been met with resistance from the Coastal staff.
Yeah, because I think one of the big challenges that we're going to run into is our arena cycle was 2021 to 2029, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so we're like essentially almost halfway through the cycle, and it'll take, if it adds another year to it, where it's like the amount, and then it takes the projects would have to come in, and so we'll be lucky if we can get even one of these projects by the end of our arena cycle. So it's not something we can control. But I'll bring that back up during comments on this issue. So adaptive reuse is something that we all talk about all the time. And I know what we've seen is, at least in the downtown area, there's issues in how the building or the fire code specifically has been implemented. So right now, if you had a second floor office in the South Laguna Commercial District, would you be able to convert that to residential?
Hypothetically, Mayor Pro Tem, I would say the answer is probably yes.
Okay.
There would be density standards that would need to be met. Would be addressed. Those impediments would be addressed with this ordinance. I think
Okay.
the bigger issue is potentially financial feasibility in terms of retrofitting that may need to occur. Some of this is related to life safety requirements. I know that there have been discussions about the potential need for fire sprinklers on some of these older
Okay.
commercial buildings. Those are generally determinations that are made by the fire marshal and building official.
Okay. And then on page, actually come back to me. I'm done for now.
Bob?
Question on the, excuse me, on the conformity to state law, the transitional housing, supportive housing, low barrier navigation centers and SRO. Do we just, is this just merely incorporating state law requirements, or are we adding local elements on top of that?
There's very little local land use control over most of these. The one exception is probably the single room occupancy units, and that's why that section of the code is a little lengthier. We didn't simply refer back to state law for most of the requirements. But in general, a lot of this has been preempted by state law at this point.
Okay, so we're just really carrying the state law into our code.
Correct. And
those
for
who-
the most part, referring back to the appropriate section in the state government code.
Okay. And then the other, on the inclusionary housing, I'm not sure how that, maybe you could pull that screen up, but how the 10% figure was decided, because if I'm doing the math right, and I want to make sure I understand this, it says 10% of the inclusionary housing units have to be for artists. So let's say hypothetically, we'll have 100 units, a 100-unit project, which seems that would be probably the top end, right? 100 units. Under the new proposal, 15% or 15 of those units would have to be affordable, right? And then 10% of those, so 1.5 units out of 100 units would be reserved for artists.
That's correct. And that 10% language came from a recent bill that passed last year regarding the provision to reserve artist housing within an arts district. The topic came up during the Planning Commission, and so we've incorporated that specific 10% to match the law that was passed last year.
We could do more, though. We could, I mean, that seems almost
Yeah.
superfluous, right?
So
1.5 units out of 100.
so you're considering arts district requirement, the whole town, not the actual art district?
No, within the proposed provisions, it's specific to the arts district and compliant with the law passed last year, a half-mile radius.
So this only applies to the art district?
In the half-mile radius, yes.
Hypothetically, we could take out the words inclusionary and it could say 10% of the housing units in that area are for artist housing?
We could have local tenant preference policies that are compliant with other state laws,
Okay,
as opposed to the law that was passed just last year.
got it.
And those laws include fair housing laws, but they could allow us to require a greater percentage of all housing units to be dedicated to artists.
Where did we get the quarter mile? So the reduction in parking for the quarter mile from transit? Can it be a half a mile?
That was a recommendation from the Housing and Human Services Committee to the Planning Commission, which the Planning Commission accepted and recommended to council.
Does the OCTA bus count as transit?
Yes, so all
The
of
whole
our
commercial zone would be.
fixed public transit stops either serviced by our local bus and trolley system or the OCTA bus.
So are you saying that most of our commercial districts would be covered with transportation?
Yes, that is correct, Councilman.
Okay, any other questions for staff? Oh, open the public hearing. Okay, I'll open the public hearing. You guys, got something to say?
It always amazes me as to what the crowds come out for and what they don't come out for. This is an amazing piece of work. It's really exciting. And I just lost my words. Well, this is really ridiculous, so I'll have to fake it. I'm here on behalf of the Housing and Human Services Committee, which enthusiastically endorses Anthony and Jennifer's fine work. We're looking at the draft housing element progress report, and right now it's kind of discouraging because there's no affordable even on the horizon. However, 13 of the housing element points say that what you're going to decide tonight are going to move it forward. And this is really important and really a big deal. A couple items that we think you could think about is on the small projects that the mixed use is going to most likely produce, it's really hard to do affordable. And the, half low, half very low just ain't going to happen. I think if you would put change it to moderate or low on maybe on a 10 or 15 unit property, and then go to the third level of very low, because what we really want to do is get housing. And the small units are naturally affordable, as my partner, Mr. Hanauer, likes to say. Next item is on parking. The concept of decoupling parking, which is the case in much of the world, where if the tenant wants parking, they go and pay $150 a month for monthly parking, and perhaps the city can begin to offer that kind of option. That then, right now, the owner is having to build parking and then give it away, and the tenant doesn't, but all the tenants are paying for that cost. And if somebody wants parking, let them go pay for it. On conversion, the fire issue is a point that we're working on, and adding sprinklers can really make a difference on existing structures. The other thing, there is no definition of seniors, and which is kind of interesting. And so I think we ought to add a definition of seniors, since senior housing gets a whole bunch of exemptions and it can be at market rate. And I would suggest that definition should probably allow for the over 55 lady who marries a young man. So at least one of the people should be whatever we define as seniors, not necessarily both of them. Thank you.
That's Cougar housing, I know. I'm
Oh,
thinking the same
That's a
thing.
a good example, good example. Uh, Good evening. I'm Joe Hanauer, and let me add to Cody's compliments about for Jennifer and for Anthony and for the Planning Commission. This is great work, and it's exciting to see it come before you. Let me break my comments into two items. One are just a couple of technical things as I read through the report, and staff may want to comment on these. One is on the single room occupancy units. It's on page 44. It says that common facilities, each SRO, single room occupancy unit, may contain either kitchen facilities or full bath facilities, but not both. And I guess I wondered why that would be, because one could have a little Pullman kitchen and have a bath. So it's something staff may want to take a look at. Another item on page 45, and this also deals with single room occupancy units. It says heating and cooling. Number 5, each unit shall be equipped with an individual controlled heating and cooling ventilation, which I think, is an overkill. A lot of our units in Laguna don't have cooling, and to have that be mandatory seems excessive. The other is one that Cody mentioned, and this one isn't so much a technicality. It's just something that I suggest the council consider. On page 52, this is inclusionary housing requirements. This is where 5 units or more, and Cody references, require extremely low, well, let's see, households follow at least 7.5% very low, 7.5% low, and then extremely low could be substituted. And I'm suggesting you add moderate. The reason is, if you think of 5 units or more, if one of those 5 is at the very low, it's about $1,200 for Orange County. And if market for these 700 square foot units is $3,000, and you do the math, you're reducing the income, and developers will stop at 4. They won't go to 5. And so if we put moderate in, which is about $2,100 or so, $2,000, that delta isn't as great. And that at maybe at 10 units or more, we can take moderate out, but I'm suggesting you consider that. And the last item technically is just, where is this under? I covered up the page 53. It talks about housing units may be rented or sold to qualifying non-artist households, but qualifying isn't defined, and staff may want to take a look at that. So those are just, I guess, 4 technicalities, and one that is more, substantive. Let me, though, address another thing that Alex touched on, and that is that if it takes 18 months to 24 months for coastal to approve this, and if at that time a property owner comes in with a proposal, and it takes the Planning Commission and Council a year to approve it, which it probably would. So now we're at 3 years. And then if it takes that person a year to put together their working drawings, get them submitted and approved, that's probably another 18 months. We're now at 4.5 years. And then construction of a year to a year and a half, we're at 6 years. So we could be at 6 years, not could be, we will be at 6 years before anything is produced through this proposal. So I have 2 potential solutions, and I've been wrestling with this one for quite a while. As some of you know, we're working on a demonstration project that's been going on for 3 or 4 years. And I've been thinking of how we deal with it in light of this coming forward. And I think there's two solutions, both should be considered. One is that the property owner could submit a proposal once the council approves this, could submit a proposal, take the risk. They take the risk that Coastal will approve it eventually. They could submit a proposal. Planning Commission and council could approve it contingent on Coastal finally approving it. The party could again take on the additional risk of doing their working drawings because they believe it'll be approved. And they could submit the working drawings and they could be processed by the city. So by the time that Coastal approves it, if it takes 2 years, these plans could be approved. Now we just have a year, year and a half for construction. So that would cut in half the amount of time it would take. Another possibility, and I would suggest both of these be considered. Another possibility is that there are some elements, and I'm not certain which ones, staff may be more familiar with it, probably is. There are certain elements of this code change, these code changes, that don't require coastal approval. Some others do. And somebody could go ahead and move forward with a project and get approval from planning and from the council eventually for a project that complies with those elements that don't require coastal approval. And this council could approve those, contingent on the owner agreeing to complete the project that's being reviewed that requires coastal approval for certain elements once coastal approves it. So the person could go ahead and construct the project, do everything they need to do for those things that the council can approve, so long as they come back and add the completion of the project once that coastal approves it. So that's another example. And, you know, I mean, one of the examples is that let's say that right now, 2 apartments, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 apartments could be approved today. It's when we get to 3 or more that 25% have to be affordable. So somebody could construct 2 apartments today, redo their ground floor, which, by the way, freshens up the town because commercial is now upgraded. And once that coastal approves what you're considering, they'd be obligated to come back and add the 2 other apartments. So these would be 2 ways to get things going instead of having people sit there with their hands folded and take 6 years to get something produced. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I think I'll close the public hearing, bring it back to council.
So I think, I mean, this is a really good ordinance. The thing that just I've spent probably months, you know, thinking about this in my head is just the whole inclusionary housing policy. Because, you know, I obviously there's a state housing crisis, and the solution that a lot of people come up with is inclusionary housing, because which is essentially this idea that, oh, you can get affordability without the government putting in a subsidy. That's how I see inclusionary mandates. And it sounds like a really good idea, but there's so many unintended consequences, because there's only 2 ways to pay for it. Is you have the other tenants who are not in the affordable unit, you know, subsidizing it in their rent, which can work out if the market can bear that rent, or, you know, the property owner, their property is going to be less valuable, who's selling it to the developer. And in that case, you're incentivizing non-residential, which is the exact opposite of what we want to do here. So you know, it's funny because it's like if we had a pizza shop come in for approval, and if we said to that owner, we want 20% of the pizza to be affordable, people would think that we're crazy. But that's how we treat housing, which is just interesting in the middle of a housing crisis. So I'm skeptical of inclusionary housing, and I think right now there hasn't been any really multifamily housing in our community. And when you look at the interest rates and you look at all the other factors, it's already hard enough to do a market rate housing project, and especially in you know, in infill environment, it's even tougher. So that's what I'm sort of struggling with. So I have a couple of small recommendations for the inclusionary ordinance before, and I want to hear what my colleagues think, but on page 51 or 51 and then 59 is a bigger number. It exempts projects that are not proposing residential units. And then number 2 is projects which are developed in accordance with the terms of a development agreement that was approved by the city prior to the enactment of this ordinance. I would cross out that was approved by the city prior to the enactment of an ordinance, because I think if you have a development agreement, it makes sense that could be the substitute for the inclusionary. If let's say there was hypothetically a bigger project, I think a development agreement can work to satisfy the inclusionary. So that would be my one small suggestion. And then on the actual numbers, I would probably want to go, because, you know, I watched the planning commission discussion and their conclusion was kind of the same as, well, I don't know if it was the same, but what one of the commissioners was saying was that if you make it 5 units as triggering the inclusionary threshold, everyone's going to do 4. If you make it 7, people are going to do 6. And that's what we've seen anecdotally in Laguna Beach. When you have when it gets triggered at 3, people do 2 units or they do commercial, which is not what we want if we want to make this policy actually successful. So I think I would be interested in maybe moving up to a 7-unit minimum, and then make it 15% and allow for people to choose between very low, low, and moderate. And I think that there are incentives for why someone would want to choose low or very low because of the density bonus and other factors. So those would be the two. Those would be the recommendations that I'm interested in. But I also want to hear what my colleagues think.
Can you restate what you were talking about, the development agreement? So you're just saying that an applicant would come forward with a proposal and it would be negotiated within that and agreed upon, whatever it happens to be,
Yeah.
without any requirements?
Which is typical, because as written, it basically says only if that development agreement was adopted prior to the enactment of this ordinance, where I think the development agreement can handle the inclusionary components.
So development agreements need to comply with the underlying criteria, right?
Not-
Correct.
Oh, really?
Well, you have, as development agreement has to be consistent with the zoning
Yeah.
generally. And so then the reason that I believe that D2 exists is that it's clarifying that development agreements are vested rights. And so that you can't apply a new law onto the development agreement. I think that was the purpose of that exemption.
Okay.
And so I think what you're proposing is to exempt out from the inclusionary generally development agreements, which, with the, I guess the premise being that you can separately negotiate
Exactly.
something into that. So I suppose you could do that because it will be compliant with the underlying zoning because it will be exempt. Development agreements will be exempt. I'm just trying to think through how you make that policy clarification, because I do think that's your goal is to achieve inclusionary in a development agreement still.
And the reason I came up with this is it's not my idea, but Costa Mesa, Santa Ana, their inclusionary ordinance allows for that. And then Costa Mesa, I think they haven't adopted an inclusionary program, but theirs also contemplates this exemption.
So Alex, on the other suggestion on the 15%,
Yeah.
are you saying the entire 15% could be moderate?
Yeah.
I see. So the 7.5 goes away. It just, at least it would just say 15%, very low, low or moderate.
Correct.
Megan, I have a question. So Joe's idea about kind of getting everything ready to go so that you can do some overlap work while you're waiting for Coastal Commission to catch up. What do you think about that?
I like the idea behind it.
Oh, yeah.
Certainly. I think that I was trying to think through the practicalities of that. I think there could be some hiccups in doing that. Not least of which is that Coastal doesn't always sign off on our, I think staff has indicated that we're hearing good things, but I think that that's one concern is that Coastal doesn't sign off on something and we have a change. And then we have effectively authorized a project to proceed on, a law that's going to not be exactly as it was intended when the project conditionally was approved.
Mhm.
We don't typically conditionally approve projects in that, like with the law pending, we conditionally approve projects subject to conditions, right? So I think that there might be other ways to achieve that goal. I was thinking through the possibility of whether an urgency ordinance that's similar to the SB 9 ordinance that we just did would make sense in order to make, and we can attempt to make those findings. We'd have to, in order to adopt urgency ordinances in the coastal zone, we have to make specific findings. We have to make sure we could do that. But I think the goal, I certainly understand the goal is to
Mhm.
be able to start moving immediately.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think that may be one solution is to go that route.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, it seems like you almost have to. We're just going to bump up against the 29. We're not going to get there.
Yeah.
There's
And-
no way.
Well, what does staff think of Mr. Hanover's proposals, recommendations? Do you have qualms about it or, and is there certain risks involved with the developer, I suppose?
No, staff has no comment. We would take the advice of the city attorney.
Okay,
I mean, the developer's taking all the risk.
yeah,
In addition to what Joe pointed out with the heating and cooling, so he's suggesting that heating would be, of course, you need heating, but you don't need cooling. And I agree with that. And you stopped short on number 6, Joe. It says closets, each unit shall have a closet space of what, 72 cubic feet? That kind of stuff I just don't think that we need in any of this. I mean, there are solutions, there are storage solutions and very creative solutions that go into this stuff nowadays. And I just would like to see less of those kinds of things,
Yeah.
restrictions built into any of this.
Why would we specify that?
It's a great question and great conversation. The intent was perhaps twofold with the crafting of the SRO standards, which are quite unique, and we don't really see this type of regulation in other contexts, to your point, Councilman Orgill. One was we wanted to ensure that SRO projects, should they come forward, which they may not, that they were being proposed for their intended use, which is generally an adaptive reuse project. Oftentimes, as mentioned during the presentation, they involve a conversion of a hotel. And so there are shared facilities, for example. We didn't want to create like a loophole to create housing units where maybe it was inappropriate to do so outside of these specific housing types. And then also we wanted to try to address minimum habitability requirements with these types of retrofit projects. Now, granted, it's quite common in the city to not have cooling within the home or a residential unit. All that certainly is up for discussion.
And so you obviously are aware, I mean, a lot of closets nowadays are freestanding furniture systems, and I just think to have it built into the project is unnecessary, is my point. Is there any, do we have any, so we know that the quarter mile covers us, right? We're sure about that? Okay. Less restrictions, the better. I mean, right, we have, the reason that this crisis exists is because of supply.
Yeah.
And the more obstacles we put in the way of supply, then the bigger the problem gets. So I think that we need to do what we can to encourage supply and not let the inclusionary become so burdensome it prevents it.
Well, I like Alex's suggestion about the moderate part, because that any incentive we can provide to build housing is good. And moderate is only $2,200, as Joe described. So
Is there
a lot better than nothing.
is there consensus on this going to from 5 to 7 units? Is there support for that?
I think it's good. I think it's good.
I'd go to 10.
I'd go to 10. I do like this idea of an urgency ordinance.
I do
The
too.
more I think about it, because without having a compliant housing element, we subject ourselves to the builder's remedy, which I think that would actually be a true, compared to, it's when you compare that to SB 9 projects, a builder's remedy project would be an emergency, in my opinion.
It is.
Although I don't believe you're in the builder's remedy realm because you have a certified housing element. As long as you continue to progress and like submit your annual progress reports and everything else, you should be out of the builder's remedy world. Notwithstanding that, you have very real criteria in your housing element that you are obligated to meet within this housing element cycle. And the conversation about the delay that's created by the Coastal Commission is a very real practical implication to you being able to meet the goals and the policies that are required of your housing element. So we certainly could look at whether we can make those findings. I think there are grounds for findings, and bring that back.
I like that a lot.
So it would be either that, the emergency ordinance, or look into what Costa Mesa is doing as well.
On the DA specifically.
Well,
that-
he had mentioned that,
I think it's two separate things.
I was just talking about the development agreement.
okay, just the development agreement, okay.
So Cody brought up, and I was looking at the definition section here, should we add a definition of senior? We use the term senior citizen housing several places, or senior citizen housing project. Should we define senior citizen?
Councilman Whalen, I think that's a great idea. What staff might suggest is pulling from definition in state law, specifically density bonus law, treats senior citizens as persons 55 or older. Might be a starting point, but it's up to the city council.
Yeah, I mean, is there a reason to go, not to go 55 and older? Like, there are a lot of senior communities that are 55. You were saying 65?
55 would be our
55,
recommendation as well. Yes.
Yeah. I'd just do it at 55. I had a couple other comments or questions in here on page 38 of the report. This is lot consolidation incentives, intent and purpose. I just couldn't quite follow this first sentence. To encourage the assemblage of smaller lots into larger lots that can be developed and more efficiently with an affordable or senior citizen housing project, 100% affordable or ownership housing projects, or 100% senior citizen housing projects. So is it any affordable or senior housing project? Isn't that redundant, or are we just saying lot consolidation has to be for 100% affordable rental or ownership project? In other words, couldn't you strike out that can be developed more efficiently with an 100% affordable rental or ownership housing project? What does that first phrase, with an affordable or senior citizen housing project, mean?
it is a bit wordy, and there is an opportunity there to condense the language a bit.
Yeah, maybe you could just say with an 100% affordable rental or ownership project, just strike. And
Can be market rate though.
I'm trying to get to the intent of the section, which is it requiring 100% affordable rental or ownership or 100% senior citizen?
So the
Something,
next section, section B, under qualifications, we go into the details of 100% affordable or 100% senior. In the intent and purpose, we probably don't need to be so specific. So to simplify, one option would be to simply refer to affordable or senior citizen housing projects.
Okay.
Maybe even include rental or ownership, affordable or senior housing projects.
Okay.
So would that include more than one parcel? Or is that just combining two
It's combining up to 3 parcels into one development site.
of
Then-
any size?
Oh, excuse me. The restriction is on total lot area. An earlier version of this ordinance capped the number of lots. That's since been struck. The restriction is on total lot size, which cannot exceed 25,000 square feet with the merger.
Okay, and then Anthony, question on page 41. This is on subparagraph B there of, it says applicability, and the following exceptions from the development standards apply, and they list the various zones. Elsewhere in here, the institutional zone is listed, but it's not listed there. For the exceptions section, is there a reason there? You might just look at that.
Councilman Whalen, I believe the reference to the institutional zone is actually under a separate section related to the mixed-use housing project standards.
This is under, 26, 25, 96, 30, infill and mixed-use housing projects. Subparagraph B. I'm just asking because I saw it in mixed use elsewhere. It was referring institutional, but doesn't need to be there. That's fine. So then, one question on the home occupation. There's a lot of detail here. It looks good, but what wasn't clear, the permitting process was very clear, but how do you, what's the enforcement? How do you revoke it if somebody is just blatantly not conforming to the permitted use? I couldn't track how that would happen. Maybe it's another section of the code, but what if somebody gets a permit and then they've got 50 people a day coming to the house instead of 2 or whatever?
It's a great question, Councilman Whalen. So we would revert back to the general revocation procedures in the zoning ordinance. It's not part of the draft ordinance before you this evening, but I can quote it for you here. To initiate a revocation of a permit, that revocation would be initiated by the authority that granted that approval, or by the director of
So
community
here, in
development.
this case, it would be the director. Yeah,
Correct.
okay, thank you. And then on page 49, item 14 at the top, which is parking, it's very subjective. It says the use shall not significantly impact the on-street parking in the neighborhood. How's the director going to decide that? Or
It would be certainly difficult to police. In general, with the home occupation provisions, staff's expectation is that an operator would probably need to significantly depart from the requirements of their permit in order to lead to actionable recourse for the city, either through code enforcement remedies or ultimately revocation of the permit. Separately, there is a standard related to the number of car vehicle trips that are permissible in association with these uses, either 6 or 12 daily vehicle trips, depending on if the business is located in a residential or commercial zone. So perhaps that's the answer.
yeah, I think that might be the answer. In other words, you've got objective customer vehicle trips are, limited, right? Number of employees, you've got controls. I would take 14 out because I don't know how the director would determine without doing some kind of traffic study or something. Would be unnecessary. Maybe, let's see, I might have one or two more. Oh, yeah, I do. I mean, I don't know what the rest of the council thinks about, but that 10% calculation for artist housing is, I mean, why even have it if you're going to get down to one unit?
It's hard to implement too,
Yeah.
because the idea of having to go out to rent it to an artist, but then I don't know. I don't know if the city should get involved in managing that for private property owners.
Well, we have it. We are managing it out with the project, the Dorney project.
But that's specifically for artists. Where, oh,
Well, yeah,
you're
I mean,
talking
it's the same
about,
thing. It's.
so I guess I'm talking about the other, I'm talking about the provision where you have to rent it out to an artist before you offer it to anyone else. For the for the inclusionary units that aren't in the arts, within the proximity of the arts district.
Well, I think we should either make it a meaningful number or eliminate it.
I think we should just eliminate it.
Yeah, the one in the canyon was actually built as artist housing, so it was different. So back to the mergers, when it talks about 100% affordable rental or ownership, how do we deal with the ownership as if they sell? So they're restricted to 35 years, right?
Yes, that is correct, Councilman.
And then I guess it's just somehow is there a formula for resale? That they just have to follow some kind of a state standardized formula for?
There is, which is updated annually by the state and county.
Okay. And we want to make those 100%, huh?
There's one small exception for mixed-use projects, provided that 85% of the floor area is for the residential use. That was staff's proposal.
Seems too restrictive.
Okay, team, it's getting, so how are we going to
get
get all
together
this
here.
stuff incorporated here?
So go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, a lot of interest expressed. What we'd like to do is continue the item to, I believe, the April 23rd date, during which time we can, great suggestions. We want to be able to implement them. And so I have, as you do, a copy of what we've got upcoming. There is some work to be done. We want to do everything that you want us to do, and we can do that by returning to you April 23rd, so you've got a product that you can approve and adopt.
Can we?
And then
Oh, go ahead.
in the meantime, we can think about this urgency ordinance.
Hmm.
Yeah, that'll certainly give us an opportunity
Yeah.
to work that out.
One other thing, can we, I don't think there's been discussions with the building department about how to make the adaptive reuse work. So can we maybe collaborate on that ahead of this meeting so that we can incorporate, if there was to be a recommendation related to adaptive reuse? Because I don't think that'd be significant here, but I just think if we can have that meeting in the interim.
A lot of that's going to be dictated by just the building regulations, right? State and federal.
There's other jurisdictions it doesn't need to be a part of this, but I think I would just want to give direction to staff on that.
One of the things that Anthony mentioned was density, right? I mean, that could be dealt with through here.
Correct. And we are trying to address that particular barrier. To your request, Mayor Pro Tem, staff can certainly coordinate those meetings in the interim and report back
That'd be great.
in April.
Yeah, look at because Santa Ana has an ordinance that contemplates alternate means and methods to comply with the fire code. So we could use that as a model. That's my only feedback.
Okay.
So, Anthony, have you captured all of our comments?
Yes, Mayor.
So obviously, we're not approving this tonight. We're going to continue it with our suggested modifications to April 23rd. That's my motion.
We'll be ready.
I'll second. And it's an excellent work product.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
really a
Yeah,
good
very
work product.
Very good work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much, you guys. Hey, we're busy up here.
Twenty-one.
Let's go. Come on, we got 15 minutes before 11.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, next item is the 2024 community survey. And I don't think, do we need a staff report on this? I don't think so.
I don't.
I don't. Does anybody need a staff report? No, okay. Okay, council, what are your comments?
You want to just open the public hearing?
Yeah, we'll open the public hearing, close the public hearing. Okay, let's get on with it.
Good.
That was easy.
I appreciate, had requested our last meeting that staff come back with this. I appreciate this coming back so quickly. I think I've had a chance to talk to Gavin. You know, we're dealing with a certain timeline, right? If we want to proceed with anything for the November ballot. But the good news is we're ahead of the schedule we actually were on for Measure P, right? Back in 2018, I think it was. And Gavin's outlined some of the you know, the options here, but I would be interested in serving as one of the ad hoc committee members to work with staff to get this thing finalized. I've had a fair amount of experience with these in my professional work, so and prior city efforts. So I think
Can I
if
ask,
council was supportive of that, I'd step up for that.
can I ask you a question?
Yep.
So are you and Mark working on the revenue enhancements?
We have had a couple meetings to discuss that with staff. Yeah.
No. Yeah, I'd be happy to join the ad hoc committee with Bob.
Okay.
So, let's see, this is a good step. So my recommendation would be, since you guys are already working on revenue enhancements, my recommendation would be Bob and Mark.
Okay.
Are we gonna, How are we gonna go about this?
I would just like to expand recommendation one, just to make it clear, would direct the city manager to prepare a community survey and retain a consultant. Because then item 2 talks about working with the consultant. And okay,
Okay, yeah. So let's see what the recommendation is. Does anybody have any further comment? No, okay, my recommendation would be, I already did. Yeah. Okay, and one is direct the city manager to prepare a community survey. Ad hoc committee, I propose Mark and Bob, and provides directions to staff and the ad hoc committee regarding topics of revenue enhancement to be included in the survey. That's my motion. Is there a second?
Just for clarification, the recommendation is for city manager to retain
Yep.
a pollster and to work with the subcommittee and the pollster to write up and administer the poll.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, I'll amend my motion. For clarification. Is there a second?
Somebody thought there should be some clarification, and darn it, therefore I'm asking for it.
Is there a
The
second?
poll Based on revenue enhancement.
Yes, entirely.
Yeah.
Oh, that was the point.
Yep.
I'm tired.
okay, second.
All in favor? Aye. Oh, we have one more item here, you guys. I think we have to do a continuance on this appeal, all right? So this is Appeal A, which is a public hearing for appeal of approval on design review at 22-1027 for a 230 square foot addition to an existing two-story dwelling at 31616 Second Avenue in the Village Community Zone. And there's been a request to continue this appeal. I'll open the public hearing, close the public hearing. Can I get a motion on this?
I'll make the motion.
Madam Mayor, for clarification, we're going to leave the public hearing open and then
Oh, that's
continue the
right.
item.
Okay. Yeah, we'll leave the public hearing open. Okay, can I get a motion? Move the recommended action. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we're adjourned until the 29th at, do we have closed session 4 p.m.? 4 p.m. Okay. Night.